The library was my space, and there was just so much.
To the Harbor Grace excursion with the boys to have a time.
Out of curiosity, would you send the same books to Prime Minister Mark Carney that you sent?
Thanks for not asking about whether I'd send books to Donald Trump.
I'll just scratch
which I
that.
have been asked. And no, I don't see the point with Mark Carney. He's a more enlightened man than Stephen Harper was. So, and that was a one-time thing, because you know what? You don't want to weaponize art.
No.
And you don't want to shame people who don't read, because there's nothing wrong with not reading. You travel through life the way you want to, the way you can. It's just if people with power. So, no, I wouldn't do it again. But I was happy to have done it once and made me read or reread books that I hadn't read in a long time.
Now, Yann, tell us about The Son of Nobody.
Well, it's Son of Nobody.
Son
no
of
the.
Nobody. Like Life of Pi.
No the.
What do you have against definitive articles? Let's start there.
Well, let's start there.
No.
So it is no, but actually. So people often, even who've loved the book, call it The Life of Pi. And of course, when I wrote the book, I thought of how do I title this? And it seemed natural to say The Life, but it is a definite article, which to my mind meant there's only one life. It's the life, that life, the only life. And since Life of Pi is about subjectivity and how you can read things so differently, a definite article didn't seem suitable. So I thought it could be A Life of Pi. But that seemed kind of odd. So then I just dispensed with all articles. There's your answer. Son of Nobody, no the, because it's someone's nickname. You wouldn't say the Peter, the Jane. So it's Son of Nobody, no article. There we go. You're all right. Don't worry. You're doing well.
Well, in a sense, it could be
Jess.
almost about two sons of nobody, in a sense, because the structure of this book is so incredibly ambitious. I'm not sure I've seen anything like it. And would you like to, I'm sure many of you have a copy, and you're looking at it and being, what the heck? There's something up top, and then down below there are footnotes. What's going on here? What's going on here?
So I want, in a sense, to tell two stories. It's a story. Son of Nobody is a story of a scholar who discovers a lost Trojan War tradition, or what he suspects is a lost Trojan War tradition, among this trove of papyrus called the Oxyrhynchus papyri, which was, in truth, in history, a trove of papyrus found in a town called Oxyrhynchus, which is south of Cairo, which had the peculiarity of not being directly on the Nile, but on a canal called the Bar Youssef. And when the Bar Youssef dried up, people abandoned Oxyrhynchus. But it was a town that was never flooded by the Nile. And so one thing that meant is that the garbage dump of Oxyrhynchus, nothing ever rotted, because there was no moisture whatsoever. So the discovery of Oxyrhynchus was literally the town's garbage dump, on which there's genuine garbage, but there was also tons of papyrus that had been written on both sides to such an extent that they couldn't be used anymore, and so they were thrown out. And it's one of the great archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. They found sayings of Jesus from the Gospel of Thomas, one of the non-canonical Gospels. There's a lovely poem of Sappho that was discovered in the stuffing of a mummified crocodile. There's lots of Homer, some other Greek authors, and then lots of just routine stuff, wills, petitions, letters, all kinds. So it was a slice of life in 500 years of a town. It's a mound of papyrus. It's like over 500,000. Anyway, and so this scholar, Harlow Dunn, who has a fellowship to Oxford for a year, discovers among them the traces of a lost Trojan War epic. A lot of stories were told of the Trojan War. The best known one, of course, is the Trojan horse and all that, which is in fact not in the Iliad. But there were other traditions that were then lost, but people remembered the story and they carried on, and that's why we know about the Trojan horse and other stories. Anyway, he discovered this lost one, and he tries to reconstruct it. But so it was two stories I was trying to tell. The story of this lost tradition, and then the story of the scholar himself. And also I wanted to comment on, because I didn't want to assume that people had read the Iliad, because I hadn't. I only read it a few years ago. So I wanted to both comment on the Iliad and Homer, but also on this new epic called the Soad. And then also the story also tells of Harlow. So the best way to tell the story, I thought, was to divide the page in two, and at the top half have the lost fragments in verse, and then at the bottom have footnotes. And I delighted in the footnotes. I was very happy to give a starring role to footnotes, because I like footnotes. And also they're very versatile. You know, if you think of it, one footnote can be completely unrelated to the next footnote, to the next one. So it allowed me to comment on a lot of things without having to worry about chronology, because it's
Yeah.
the nature of a footnote to be varied. So it allowed me to deliver a lot, and each then has its own separate space. The top of the page is the past, is 3,000 years ago, and the bottom of the page is now, is the current story of Harlow Dunn in Oxford.
And those footnotes act in the usual way, in that they're explaining this lost epic, but they're also telling your protagonist's story, Harlow Dunn's story, which happens to be a very emotional story.
Right.
And I thought at first when I got a copy of the book that it might be difficult to read.
Yeah.
It was not difficult. Raise your hand if you've had a chance to read the book yet. It just came out. Oh, look at, there we go. Just came out on March 31st. But the rhythm of the book washed over me, and I read it, I think, in about two to three sittings on a GO train. I hope that's okay. It's an absolutely beautiful book. But that structure, as I was saying, it's just so unusual. How did that come into your head?
Not Pale Fire. Everyone mentions Pale Fire by Nabokov, which also has a poem and commentary. That's as I said to one person, just because you've written a poem in a wood in Vermont doesn't mean you were inspired by Robert Frost. You just happened to be in a wood in Vermont and you wrote a poem. So that came very early on. So I read the Iliad, which I expected to be sort of venerable and dull, and it's not. And suddenly I started getting ideas, and I early on said, how do I tell this so that it works? Because I thought the conventional way to do it would be to have the scholar in the present time recalling at will, at his convenience, the fragments. So these incessant flashbacks like you have in movies. And you can't have too many flashbacks. It gets tiresome. And also it seems contrived too when you have, here I am working, and here's a fragment that I pull out. I wanted them to be quite independent, and I was trying to think how I could do that. And then I suddenly realized the best way to do that would be with footnotes. And it has a broader philosophical point. You have this sort of epic, capital E, big story of a war, of a nation, of a people, and then these little tiny footnotes. And one of the lines I like in the book is I say, we're all footnotes to a greater story. And so I like this idea of these little tiny footnotes which collectively, in a sense, comment on and keep alive the top of the page, and the top of the page needing the footnotes. Because, in some texts you don't need to read footnotes, but in sometimes, like for example, the book that I loved the most that had footnotes was Dante's Divine Comedy, where it's the original road trip of Dante going through hell, purgatory, and heaven. And he was another angry man, and all the people he meets in hell he accounts for and saying, you deserve to be here because of this, that, and the other. And he does himself account for why people are there. But unless you have a PhD in Italian history of the Middle Ages, you will miss a lot. So it was definitely a book where I remember reading the cantos and loving it. It's an amazing book. And then reading the footnotes. And it was really a beautiful dance between the two. So right away, in a sense, that's what I wanted to do. And just as a Divine Comedy is not at all a hard read, I didn't want this one to be a hard read. What's the point of being difficult for the sake of being difficult? As it is, what I like too about the footnotes is some are narrative about Harlow Dunn and his life that's falling apart. But then the ones about Homer and the Soad are, I found myself in looking at Homer engagingly intellectual, because it's a wonderful, thoughtful thing looking at the Iliad. It's a really interesting book because it's a flawed narrative. It's oral. It survived for centuries being told orally. So it's a really interesting thing to look at and try to piece together and figure out. So the footnotes allowed me to do that, I thought, in a way that was very engaging.
Well, it was certainly engaging for this this reader right here. But when will it be made into a movie? Or no, maybe not. That's
well,
a
ask
tough
my
one.
agent. Actually, there is.
Is your agent here? No.
Yeah, she is actually. But there is. We were positing one thing we could do is have, and this is just, I write a book to be a book, not to be a movie. But if it were ever, because the problem is, like for example, the audiobook. How do you do an audiobook when there's page divided in two? Well, what they're doing in Canada is the top of the page is narrated by one voice, and the bottom, the footnotes by another voice. So that'll help you. And I thought to visually differentiate them as a movie. One of the proposals that my agent Jackie Kaiser was saying about the film agency in Hollywood was that one of the narratives would be told in live action and the other one in animation.
Oh, that's beautiful.
And I thought the best way to give things, to skewer things a little bit, is that the present story would be told in animation, and the past would be live action.
Oh, wow.
Just like that. But that's just, it's a book right now, and
Let's let it live as a book.
Exactly. Thank you.
Let's talk about another book or an epic poem, the Iliad. You said you just came to it for the first time a couple of years ago.
Yeah, I know.
What made it pick you up?
My partner, she said, "Oh, there's a new translation. Why don't you read it?" And I said, "Sure." And it was a wonderful translation by Stephen Mitchell, who's an American.
Yeah.
He did a translation of Rilke letters. He did a wonderful translation of Gilgamesh. I'd already read that one and his Rilke letters. So I said, "Sure." And he's a poet, and it is very much it's a breathless Iliad. Because first of all, what he does is the Iliad was told orally, and all things were added over the centuries. So, for example, there's a book 10 in the Iliad, which clearly does not fit in the sense that the Greeks go to sleep, and then naturally the next morning they wake up. And there's continuity, except there's this book 10 plunked in the middle. It's very clearly added centuries later. So Mitchell translates it, but leaves it afterwards. And also in the original epic, which was composed in the dactylic hexameter, there's what they call the scholars call these epithets, which are these descriptions. So incessantly, Achilles is described as being swift running. Even when he's standing still, he's described as swift running. And, the Trojans are incessantly described as horse taming, even when no horse is in sight. And these are done so the bard could round out his lines to get his meter going, to keep going in. And they're necessary perhaps in the dactylic hexameter when you're reciting it, but when you're reading it in English, you don't need them. So he cut all those out. So it's a much leaner one. And it was just, it blew me away. And I like that I came to it late, because when things are stuffed down your throat when you're young, sometimes it works, it's what you want, sometimes it doesn't. And so I read it late in life, so I came to it completely fresh. And I noticed so many things that maybe I wouldn't have noticed when I was young, because teachers would have been telling me about what it meant, and I read it with fresh mind. So that's maybe why it moved me so much.
That's a beautiful thing, in fact. Did you go then and read the Odyssey after? Or had you already come to that?
No, I did, but then the one that really interested me, because the Odyssey is in fact, it's more popular because it's so imaginative, but I find artistically the Iliad it has unity of time, action, and place. It's one continuous, takes place over 52 days. It's a very compact one, and the character study is really interesting, whereas the Odyssey is wildly imaginative. The Bag of Winds, and it's wildly imaginative. And I guess speaks to us more, but in a more fantastical way. The Iliad is a much grimmer work. I mean, after all, the Odyssey has a happy ending. The man gets his wife at the end. The Iliad, no one wins. It's one of these nihilistic wars, which is why I think it's so popular and it still speaks to us today, because the Trojan War was like so many wars where there are no winners. Like the Vietnam War, where the Americans lost, but did the Vietnamese really win? Their country was devastated. Of course, the good guys won the Second World War. We had to bring down Hitler, but the cost, my God, the cost. So many wars have no winners, but we always think of them in terms of having winners and losers. The Trojan War, it was a nihilistic war where not only did they, the Greeks, yes, annihilated Troy, but then the returns, when they returned, it was disastrous. Agamemnon was assassinated as soon as he got home. It'd be like Eisenhower coming back from Europe and getting assassinated. It's such a grim work, and that's also one thing that struck me reading it fresh. Is here's this work that is literally the West's first book. When the Greeks reinvented writing for the second time, the first thing they committed to the page was this magnificent work called the Iliad. And you'd think, therefore, being their first book, it'd be a fun book, one that would sort of say, hey, we're Greeks and we're the best. But no, it portrays the Greeks at their absolute work as profoundly dysfunctional. Nothing but these angry people, mostly men, but Helen too gets angry. All the gods get angry. As I said at one point, no one gets along, no one listens to anyone, and there's hell to pay. And the tragedy of it is that there's no redemption. Yes, Achilles kills Hector, and then Priam asks for his body back, and Achilles relents. That's as good as it gets. You give someone back their dead son's body.
Yeah.
That's as good as get as mortals. And then if you die, then it sucks even more, because, the Elysian Fields, which was sort of the top, hotel floor of hell in Greeks, was no great shakes. It was this very great place. They move around like shades. They want to be back among the living. I mean, it's a really, really... So basically the Greeks, when they first wrote down, they were basically saying, life is terrible. Life is terrible. It really is. There's the brief love of among each other, but then it's all terrible. And that's another thing that struck me, is the emotional tone, the despair that comes through where no one wins, no one's happy. What do you do with that? This is 3,000 years ago, guys. There's a lot more living to be done. What do you do with that misery? And that's what struck me, is that the echo that was heard hundreds of kilometers to the east in this other foundational story of the West, the story of Jesus of Nazareth, which, by the way, I invoke with no sense of belief on your part or anyone's part, just as a counter-narrative of Troy, was the story of Jesus of Nazareth. Same grim circumstance where life sucks, life is terrible, but a completely different emotional response. And I thought, here's an echo here. Surely they are, and they are linked. Everything was written in Greek, right? The Iliad, of course, was written in Greek. The earliest Christian documents are Paul's letters. They're written in Greek. All the Gospels were written in Greek. And if you spoke Greek, you knew of Homer. Homer was tattooed on the Greek language. He was everything to the Greeks. He was totally Greek. So I just saw these echoes of these two. So at one point, the key line in the book, at the very end, is one about feet. We walk on feet of dreams. And to me, there's one foot of the West that walks with anger and one with love. Anger, love, anger, love, anger, love. You see that today too, with the insanity that's happening right now in the U.S. With what, there's the hateful foot is coming down hard, and then we need the other foot. But as Westerners, I think we move with those 2 feet. So
essentially, it almost sounds like an evergreen story. It's always maybe been this way. While you were writing it, did the present ever, I guess, come into mind while you were re-examining the oldest story?
Not really. I'm not politics is important, but it's of the moment. And art, in my experience of it, is not of the moment. Anything of art, song, play, sort of lives through time and doesn't necessarily age. Like, one of the things out of Life of Pi, I grew up completely secular with no gods. My parents were fiercely anti-clerical, coming from Quebec, where the Catholic Church did and does such terrible things, kills children, puts down women, gays, Jews, etc. We were totally non-religious, and art replaced the gods of yore. And so I love the arts. It's a form of magical thinking. You posit imaginary things, but your life in reality is much better for it. And then when I a lot of latent discovery, go into India, I saw manifestations of religion that I didn't find personally offensive. I'd never been offended by Islam or Hinduism or Jainism or Buddhism. And I saw this beauty that I hadn't noticed before. And I realized that religion is also a form of magical thinking where you go beyond the rational and it makes sense of things. We're not just computers. We're not just animals looking after our needs. We can posit other alternate worlds, and you access that through magical thinking. And both art and religion echo that. And so, I forgot what you said, but that was somehow my answer.
I could listen to you talk. Every time you speak, I think of 3 questions, and I'm like, I don't need to write them down. They're all up here. They're not.
Why was I saying
But
this?
one thing I would like to go back to, because we were talking about translation in ancient Greek, and I studied classics in my undergraduate, not the language of Greek or Latin, just the arts and architecture. But a friend of mine went all the way through and did her master's, and I remember her talking to me about having read the Iliad in translations and thinking, oh yeah, pretty good book. And then finally getting advanced enough in her Greek to be able to read it in ancient Greek. And when she got to that book 24, where Priam does go to collect the body of his son Hector from Achilles, she broke down in tears, which always stayed with me and made me regret some things, aka not taking ancient Greek. But there is a question here, because I'm presuming you don't read ancient Greek.
I do not.
And yet, your works, I also presume, have been translated into a number of different languages. Talk to me about, is there any anxiety when you're taking something that you have crafted in your first language and you're giving it to someone else? There's a great deal of trust, presumably. Does that ever occur to you, like what someone reading one of your books in Italian is getting?
It's a good question because you're always afraid of what will be lost in translation. Because there's obviously something gained. If someone doesn't speak English, they can only read a book in translation in their native language, or something is gained. So, for example, I love the Russians, but that's a misnomer because to me they're the English, because I didn't read them in Russian. I read all my Russians in English, and so I can't quantify all that I've lost. And someone who speaks Russian would probably say, oh my God, there's so much of the flavor in Tolstoy of Russia, the soul comes through, you're missing so much. Well, what can I do? I don't speak Russian. I'm not going to learn Russian to read Tolstoy. I'll read it in English, and I loved it. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, the act of translation is a curious one. There's always a sense that something is lost. I just finished reading, funny you should mention this, a book by David Bellos, who translates Pérec, who's a French writer. And he's on and on about translations, arguing to some extent, which I think is specious, that translations aren't necessarily weaker than the original, which I find puzzling, because I do find the originals always better. I remember once reading Shakespeare in French, and it felt completely absurd. It just didn't, it seemed all wrong. Now, I guess because I'm familiar with the original language, that's the other too. If it's hidden, then you don't know. Out of sight, out of mind, you don't know.
Right.
But when my stuff has been translating, actually my mother tongue actually is French. I happen to always go to school in English, but my mother tongue is in French. So in fact, my parents translated Life of Pi. And so I love translation because it's one of these endless, like, bridge games. I don't know, play bridge, but you're endlessly trying to get something done that can't invariably get done properly, but it's a fun trying to get the transition over the transit. I loved working on with my parents, but that comes to the fact that it's my parents. Like your friend, she was so familiar with the English. When she got to the ancient Greek, I wonder if it wasn't just that suddenly she'd left her original language and like you're moved because you're in a foreign country, and therefore you are a different person, and suddenly you're open up more. Like I loved working on the French version of Life of Pi because it was with my parents. But when I look at Life of Pi in French, it also seems somewhat wrong. Like, what, he's Indian and he's speaking French? No, come on. In India, because it was colonized by the English, they speak English. But it is an act of trust. Like, I have no idea about Life of Pi in Hungarian. Or Russian, or Chinese, or Japanese.
But it's just fascinating how you must let go, and it exists on its own once it's put out into the world.
But you know what? We fill holes. Like I remember a really funny story about a writer named Clive Cussler. I've never read Clive Cussler, but he's a popular writer, and I know this because my American editor had edited him, and she said, this was early in her career, it was one of his first books, a big fat thriller of a tome in 4 parts, and by some catastrophic mistake of publishing, part 3 was missing. It went from part 1, 2 to 4. And they were, first of all, they were afraid of what Clive Cussler would do, but they said, oh my God, we're going to get a deluge of letters. They didn't get a single, no one complained.
Wow.
No one complained. Why? Because readers somehow made this huge leap where 150 pages of missing action, and they just somehow filled the hole. So I think in translations we do that. We just fill in the holes and in a sense make it our own story. So they did that with Clive Cussler. They'll do that with Homer.
They could do that, exactly.
And with me.
Now, Yann, you keep mentioning Life of Pi. That's one of your earlier books.
Yeah, I heard of it? Yeah.
I think I have. I'm reading here
it.
an enormous success, critically, commercially, and then cinematically. After something like that, does the next book, and there were many books after, including this one, does it feel freer in a sense because you've proven yourself on that international level, or harder because the world is listening more closely?
No, it wasn't harder. I found success as a writer. It is certainly validating. Anyone gives you a compliment, makes you feel good. So you're a bit more confident, that's great. So it is validating. So I think success as a writer certainly maybe brings light to your strengths, but that's your strengths in this book. When you try to write that book, you're not using the same strengths because it's a different book. So your strengths, do they carry over? It's a mystery. And success as a writer doesn't do anything about your weaknesses. Whatever your weaknesses might be, I don't have a particularly strong sense of place, for example, because I've moved around so much. I don't have a particular sense of place. People who endlessly go on about, and this will sound like I'm a moron here, but people who endlessly go on about relationships. A boy and a girl getting along, and they don't get along, they get along, they don't get along, da, 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 da. I guess I'm thinking, do they get along or not? Are they together or not? I don't want the details. What do they do?
Oh my God.
What do they do? So this endless inner cycle, like I remember reading Henry James, there's a portrait of a lady, and like, just get me out of the house, out into the world.
Oh my.
So, that, I'm not going to write a romance. But that's fine, I don't want to write a romance. I'm not going to write a romance. So your strengths are kind of the same, I suppose, but your weaknesses remain. So, and also, every book I write is obviously going to be a different one, because every book I write has been the result of a question. My first novel, called Self. I like all my books, by the way. It's not that I like Life anymore. Self, for example, is the story of a boy, a young man who, when he's traveling in Portugal, eats sweet potato, and the next morning he wakes up on his birthday as a young woman. And he's a woman for 7 years, and then he becomes a man at age 25. So it's kind of like Orlando, but accelerated. And that I was just interested of, what does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a woman? How does that map over on sexual orientation? I was just curious about that. I belatedly, like I'm always belated, discovering sexism. I remember in Psych 101 at university, at Trent University, a very good university, Martha.
Shout out to
I
Trent.
remember at Trent University reading in Psych 101, reading these studies where they'd said, men interrupt women more than women interrupt men. And I said, really? And the next day I was talking to a girl and I interrupt her. And I said, why am I doing that? And also studies like, for example, where they asked boys if they'd, I don't know what the age was, but he was young, he was prepubescent. They would ask him, boys, would you like to be a girl? Girl, would you like to be a boy? And I was shocked that 99% of boys did not want to be a girl, whereas some girls, a good majority, did not want to. But some would say, well, then I could play baseball, then I could ride a motorcycle. So I was saying, why is there such a... So all these little things, I'm thinking, what does it mean to be these things? So I asked myself that question. There's no trouble inside. I'm not inside my head, do they get along? I'm just looking out, saying, what does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be gay? What does it mean to be straight? So I wrote Self to look at that. But once I'd answered that, I moved on to a different question. So each one of my books is quite different. Life of Pi, quite obviously, I was looking at faith. What does religious faith mean? Why do we believe in this when there's computers? What's the deal? Why would you believe that? Well, so each one has been a different question. So I'm a different writer each time, and always with the same kind of curiosity, like this works, and then does this work? Questions, doubts, So no, the success of Life of Pi didn't change me. It obviously made me more material comfortable. I have 4 kids. I could afford to have 4 kids. And I don't have to worry about putting food on their plates. But as a writer, no, nothing's changed. I'm just,
Would you say then that because you're answering a different question with each novel, that then perhaps the only through line between those 6 novels, correct?
I don't know, I counted, but I think so.
Is that it's just a question you're interested in answering, or is there any other sort of through line that has ever occurred to you?
Well, one thing I've been interested in is the relation between fact and fiction. Naturally, as a writer of fiction, you take what is and then you invent. And what's the relation there? And I find it endlessly interesting. So, for example, just arbitrarily, if I mention W.G. Harding, Warren Gamaliel Harding, of him, if we cast our net wide and count little, we could probably gather 1 million facts. Actually, 1 million little tiny facts. Where he was born, when he was born, his childhood, his infancy, his childhood, his teenage years, what he studied, where he studied, who he met, what they thought of him, how he rose in the world, who he became. 1 million facts. Do we even know who W.G. Harding is? Do we think of Warren Gamaliel Harding? No. 1 million facts, no stories. Now you think, okay, increase the number of facts, and maybe we'll have that person be spoken of. So, Napoleon Bonaparte. There must be surely, of a man that huge in history, 50 million facts. And yes, sure enough, we all have heard of Napoleon Bonaparte, the Napoleon complex, which is a fiction. He was not particularly short. It was the English propaganda who said he was short. He was of average height. But the idea of a small man with big ambitions kind of works psychologically, so we believe it, even though it's a fiction. So, a lot of facts, you do yield stories. So I was thinking, that's interesting. A lot of facts, and some may yield stories, and some not. Now, what about the opposite? What if you start shrinking the number of facts? You also get fewer stories. Well, my great-great-great-great-aunt once removed had no children. If I have one, and I'm not sure, so there may be a fact there or not, but even if I did have a great-great-great-aunt once removed who had no children, very likely, in the rural parts of Quebec where she might have lived, there'd be nothing of her but not even her birth certificate, maybe her death certificate, and her name. That would be 2 facts associated with my great-great-great-aunt once
Yeah.
removed who had no children. 2 facts and 0 stories. So there's okay, few facts, few stories. But that's not always the case, and that's what got me going on a lot of my writing, is what if you invert that pyramid? Could it be the case that you have no facts, or very, very, very few, and a whole bunch of stories? And that's what I thought was really interesting, because yes, so for example, the one that delights me is Jesus of Nazareth. You know, if you ask people, what do you know about Jesus? Anyone, someone in, you know, in Sri Lanka or in Tajikistan, yeah, have you heard of Jesus Christ? What do you know of him? And they say, well, yes, I know he was born December 25th. Not true. He was not born December 25th. That was decided 350 years later, purely for symbolic reasons. The Romans thought that was the winter equinox. It's not. It's 4 days earlier. But they decided, these early Christians, that what better day to have a God be born but on one when there's increasing sunlight day by day. To a new God, more and more sunlight. Great symbolic date to be born. Much better than random, you know, April 7th or, you know, 25th. So what about his death? We all know when he died, Easter. Except that's a day, it's not a date.
Yeah.
And you know, what figure in history has their date of death change every year? You know, Warren G. Harding, who, by the way, was a U.S. president. Warren Harding was a U.S. president. He was the one who succeeded Woodrow Wilson. You know, he died on August 2nd, 1923. And he died on August 2nd, 1923 every year. It doesn't vary. So, you know, there's a lack of historical presence of Jesus that it doesn't compare with the historical presence of Warren G. Harding or Napoleon Bonaparte. But as I said, of Warren G. Harding, none of you, I bet, ever think of President Warren G. Harding, who was succeeded Woodrow Wilson in the early 20s of the United States. He's completely forgotten. He was not a very good president. He's totally forgotten. Yeah, there's a million facts. Jesus with, like, there's nothing. Symbolic birth in a manger. Manger's disappeared. You can't visit it. It doesn't exist anymore. Then he was forgotten by his parents when he was 12. And then there's a ministry in his early 30s. Good chunks of his life, we know nothing about him. 0. He's just, he doesn't exist in history. We don't doubt that he existed. But everything has come through oral tales and stories. So there's a case of barely any facts and a mountain of stories, an inverted pyramid. And it's exactly the same thing with Troy. There's no history there is no historical evidence of any Trojan War. Yes, there was a Troy called Wilusa Ilios in western Anatolia, and there's very slight evidence of tension between the Trojans and not the Greeks, the Hittites to the east. So there is some evidence of tension, but the way there might be between commercial partners, as one would expect, but nothing of a war. So that's what's also interesting, is this Trojan War was this foundational war of the West, and it's a fiction. So once again, I said we have no facts, fat stories. And I think that curious correlation of fact and fiction is, to me, how we live. We give and take facts as they suit us, which, by the way, is the very difficult to solve problem of Donald Trump. You notice how whenever he speaks, I've noticed the New York Times will have an article pointing out all the lies. And I see why they do that. We cannot tolerate lies in public speech, but it also slightly misses the point, because there's a case where there's no facts and big story. What Donald Trump presents to the Americans is not facts. It's story. It's a vision, one of resentment and grievance. But he gives them a story that is counter to the narrative that most Americans have experienced and that they don't believe in anymore. They feel aggrieved and lost. They don't know where their country is going. And he presents a story, and the facts don't matter. It's like you tell a Christian, you know, your guy, no facts, no death certificate, no birth certificate, there's nothing.
Yeah.
You think they're going to slap their foreheads and say, oh my God, I didn't know that. You're right, I don't believe
Well,
anymore.
that solves that.
Same thing when you take a Trump voter and you say, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong. He'll say, well, I don't care. There's these facts instead. And you'll go to those facts and say, well, those are wrong, those are wrong. At one point they're going to say, you know, I don't care. You're just a Western, Eastern Coast elite. I don't care. I believe in him because he's the prophet who's going to bring me somewhere. And it is true that a prophet, someone who has a vision, is taking you somewhere where you may not want to go. And he may massage the facts as he wants you to bring her somewhere else. So that's the problem with Donald Trump, is we have to counter him, not with counterfacts, but with a new alternative story. And that's a tough act to do, to come up with a story that people will sort of, want to rise up to. That's the problem with fighting Trump, is that he is fact-free, but he has a vision, a terrible vision.
Yann, have you always been like this?
It came slowly.
Just so clear and concise in the way whatever's in your head comes out of your mouth. It's like swift-footed Achilles, but in the head. What were you like as a child?
No, you know what? I've been talking about this book subtly for the last
Okay, so
2 weeks, so
okay.
I'm
But
getting...
you weren't just talking about the book. You're talking about so many things at
Well, they
rapid
link.
fire.
They are sort of connected. But you know what? Speaking of that, you know what? The first time I had a successful book was Life of Pi. And I remember unexpectedly it was successful. I did not think it would sell. A book about animals and religion. No one likes animals who's a grown-up. That's for kids. And no downtown reader of novels in Toronto is going to care about Jesus or Allah spoken without irony. So no one's going to read this book. Suddenly it was read, and I was doing events like this, and there'd be question periods. And I remember people asking me a question like, what does Richard Parker mean? And I'd be like, oh, wow, I didn't think of that. And they'd ask me questions about the book that I hadn't thought, because in a sense I was the engineer on the inside, trying to make the structure work, but I wasn't on the outside looking at it. So I get asking questions, and I wouldn't really know how to answer, which makes you sound stupid when you wrote the book. So I said, well, what do you think? And they gave me these brilliant answers. So the next time round, I'd feed that person's answer to my next audience.
That's smart.
So, for example, I'll give you concrete examples. The life of the Pi is at sea for 227 days, which I chose because it's a prime number. I'm not a mathematician, but a prime number can't be divided by anything but itself, 227 or 1. And I chose that because I didn't want people to have in Life of Pi sort of a cafeteria approach where they can take the orangutan, but this other element from the other story. You either believe in the story with animals or the story without. It's one or the other. They're two prime numbers. So just for me, I chose 227 because I wanted, you choose a number, it's nice to be meaningful if only for yourself. So that's why it's 227 days. Then once at a reading, a woman said to me, 227, why'd you chose that? And I said, oh, because it's a prime number. I said, I didn't know. She was kind of surprised. She said, why are you surprised? I said, well, because 22 divided by 7 is pi. It's a closest fraction to pi.
My God.
Which I didn't know, but you damn well bet the next time I'd say, well, it's a prime number, and 22 divided by 7 is pi. So hi, I am a fraud. I'm just you channeled back to you.
Done. We're finished. Actually, we are almost finished. This is the fastest experience I've ever had on the stage. We've got just under 10 minutes, and as rapidly as your brain works, I want to ask you a rapid fire. Are you ready for it, Yann?
No.
Here we go. Best odd job you had before writing paid the bills?
Oh, I had lots, actually. I didn't want to work with stuff that would weary my mind, so I was a tree planter in Northern Ontario. Then I hated it, so I was a dishwasher, and I loved being a dishwasher. It's actually religious.
Too. I loved it.
I know, you take dirty and you make clean. You're like a little priest, taking the sinful and you make them pure again, and your hands are warm. It's structured, and your hands are warm. It's quite a beautiful... I like being and I was also once... I started writing, actually, doing an odd job. I was living off my parents in Paris. I was a total leech, and I worked at the Canadian Embassy as a security guard. And at that time, and still to this day, no one particularly hates us, so it was a very leisurely job being a security security guard at the Canadian Embassy in Paris, especially if there were night shifts, in case there were some people who hated us in the depths of night. So there's nothing to do. And so that's one of the places where I started writing.
Okay. Which ancient Greek, god or human, would you most like to have a drink with?
Hades.
Excellent answer. Excellent.
You thought I'd say Aphrodite, right? No, Hades.
If Homer walked into a bar, presuming he's one person, he can also be several people if we like, what would you ask him first?
Are you depressed?
What do you think he'd make of Son of Nobody?
That's a good question. I hadn't thought of that. What would he say?
He'd give his blessing.
He said, why is it not in Greek? I don't know what he'd say.
Is there a classic that you're embarrassed about not having read yet?
I read big fat books between books. So I was, in fact, just thinking I was between Middlemarch and Don Quixote.
Oh, wow.
But Don Quixote, the question of translation, do I want to endlessly try to figure out the right translation? So I think I might tackle Middlemarch.
Okay, very nice. Is there a book you've reread the most?
A few, generally shorter ones. Ivan Illich by Tolstoy, Kafka's Metamorphosis, a whole bunch of Kafka I've read several times. Some Hemingway. Bizarrely, Willa Cather, slightly forgotten writer. I love Willa Cather.
Yeah.
Sinclair Lewis, I've read some of his more than once, but I generally don't reread much. Like, sometimes you're disappointed. Like, I remember reading The Old Man and the Sea as a kid, because it was given to me. And I liked it. Then when I reread it as an adult, I was sort of surprised at the things that I didn't notice as a young reader, like the number of times that Hemingway, you'll be surprised by this, talks about baseball in The Old Man and the Sea. Like, who knew? It's a fishing story, isn't it? Very symbolic of Jesus. Why is there stuff about baseball? But so,
there it is.
Some of those.
What's the least writerly thing about you?
Most of me, actually. Because, I'm surprised that I'm a writer. In the sense, I'm not as voracious a reader as some writers. I write slowly, sloth-like, because I enjoy it. But you see writers who write in paragraphs, not just Jane Austen. Like, remember Alexander McCall Smith? Some writers just flow. I mean, I don't flow. It's sort of one word at a time, but I kind of like it. But I'm still surprised that I've become a writer, because I don't recognize myself in some other writers.
Right.
So I said most of me.
Oh my goodness. Well, you're getting out of that one, I feel like, but I'll accept the answer. What chore do you hate the most?
Oh, cleaning toilets.
Fair, but not washing dishes. We established that.
No, exactly.
Yann, you're on a desert island. I'm allowing you one meal. I don't know how long you're going to be on this desert island, so you're going to be eating it over and over again. What is the meal?
I was just going to say tacos, because my parents used to make tacos, but no, I can't
From the
eat tacos every night.
Or real
from
tacos?
the kit. No, from the
Okay.
kit. From
Good.
the kit. My parents were not great cooks, so it was tacos from the kit. But it was my parents, so I love tacos because I love my parents. Probably sushi.
Okay, that's nice. You could
Plus
also
desert island,
It's very smart, very
freshly
smart.
available. There you go.
I'm going to allow you a VHS or a Blu-ray. Don't ask about how you'll play it. But what are you bringing?
On my desert island?
Yeah.
How to build a raft.
How to build a raft. Clever. I should end there, but I'm not going to. Hey, this occurred to me. Matt Damon, follow me here. He's playing Odysseus in Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey. Matt Damon was also in Good Will Hunting. Good Will Hunting was directed by Ang Lee, who also directed Life of Pi. So, Yann, does that make Matt Damon your best friend?
Are you sure Ang Lee directed Good Will Hunting?
Oh,
No.
shit.
No. I don't think it is. Who directed Good Will Hunting?
Gus Van Sant! Sorry.
Who did?
Yeah, it was Gus Van Sant.
Oh, there we go.
There went that great last thing I constructed on the
On the fly.
subway here. No cell service. I was so confident in it. It's not the way I wanted to end it.
You want to try again?
Yeah. Hopefully we'll have some better, more clever questions from these smart people out
There
here.
we go. Let's
Damn it.
open it up.